What is going on, everyone? Welcome to another very exciting episode right here on the MIgardener channel. In today's episode, we're going to be going through and troubleshooting a lot of problems that can happen with microgreens. This has been a pretty commonly reoccurring topic and question that we get, and I figured I'd just make this whole video about troubleshooting problems with microgreens. I'm also going to be going through some of the solutions to those problems so that you have a foundation to go off of, because I do think that microgreens are very simple, but they can be rather daunting as well. So I'm very excited about it, and with that being said, let's jump right on into it because it's probably going to be a little bit longer of an episode. So one of the first problems that we get a lot, and a very simple solution to that problem, is soil when harvesting your microgreens. It's usually worded, Luke, I can't seem to harvest my microgreens without getting soil in them, and it becomes very difficult to wash off and to process my microgreens for eating. How can I do it more cleanly? And there's a very simple solution to that. Like I said, when you grow microgreens, you grow them for the sprout phase. You don't really grow them for their adult form, and so you like to get as much as you can out of them because they're already small enough as it is. But microgreens have one more downside to them that, it's a small downside, but it is a downside. And that's that it's very difficult to get all of the microgreen sprout. One way to alleviate this problem, because when you harvest, it's best to harvest right at ridge level. That means, or right at the top of the tray level, if that has a word. The top of the tray. It's best to just keep your scissors or your knife level with that, and that way you're not going down at an angle digging into the soil. That's what brings up soil most often. But other times you're really trying to compensate for having a really deep container. So you're kind of digging in there so you have less waste because your sprouts are maybe barely coming up to the top of the container. That can be the first problem. Your container's too deep. Try going with a shallower container, one that is about 1 inch to 1.5 inches deep. And that way you're going to have a lot more microgreen to harvest from, and you won't have to worry about digging down into the tray to get those stems. Because let's face it, the stems probably account for about 25 to 30% of the microgreen weight. So if you're just missing all of those, you're really not getting as much harvest as you could. So, bring the tray down a little bit, make it a little shallower, or in contrast, if you have really inexpensive soil that you're using, fill it up a little bit more. Obviously, the deeper the gap from soil level to the top of the tray, the more waste you're going to have because you just don't want to dig in on an angle. It's the best way to get soil into your microgreens, and then it does become very difficult to clean. Another thing that can alleviate that problem is letting your microgreens grow a little bit more. So often we are fearful of leggy seedlings, and we're taught at a very early age as gardeners to give them as much sunlight as possible because we don't want them to stretch. However, with microgreens, that's actually a better way to ensuring more yield because of the fact that when they stretch, it's going to cause them to elongate, and then you can harvest them and you're going to get much more yield from them. These ones here were put into light a little bit too early. These are kale, but I'll show you a radish that I just got done uncovering. We actually cover them with a tray. We put them, well, you can see right here. We put a tray over top. And that tray over top is basically called a blackout dome by microgreen standards. And that blackout dome does not allow any sunlight or any light to get into the tray. And that causes them to stretch for that light. It's just a natural response when they don't have enough light. And you'll see here, this is what that tray should have looked like. Check out that tray. I pulled that tray off about a day too soon. When you start to see sprouts, you want to make sure that you keep that blackout dome on for another 2 to 3 days until they get about 1.5 inches tall. And then when you put them in the sunlight or the grow light, they look like this. Isn't that just beautiful? Check that out. Look at that. That's satisfying. That feels really good. But this is going to allow you to have a lot more, as you can see, a lot more yield than ones that are really short. So giving them a little extra time to stretch will help. Another common problem that we get a lot on the channel is my microgreens are falling over. They're not standing up very tall, and they don't look really pretty and lush like that tray did. What's the problem? Well, it's definitely when it comes to seeding, that's where the problem occurs. You're not seeding densely enough. When you seed So often we like to skimp on our seeds because seeds are seen as very valuable to a gardener. However, when growing microgreens, you can't skimp on seeds because we rely solely on the other seed or the other seedling or other sprout, I should say, next to that plant to support itself. They support themselves as a whole. And that's why seedlings or sprouts, or microgreens, whatever you want to call them, microgreens growing in the middle of the tray are usually more upright than microgreens on the edge. And you can see this even here where I've harvested. These ones here are all falling over because they don't have any support on that side. And if you don't have enough of a density, what can happen is they don't have enough support and they start falling all over each other because they do get top heavy because of just how tall they are. And that's, and this is by microgreen standards actually fairly short. So that's pretty much in summary, that's the solution. Just seed a little bit denser. With things like radishes, I typically will seed about 1.5 ounces of seed in a flat of this size. This is 11 inches by 20 inches. And an 1.5 ounces of radish seed does just fine. With smaller seeds like brassica, mustard, cabbage, broccoli, kale, things like that, I'll only seed about 1 ounce to no more than 1.25 ounces because that's plenty dense enough. This was at about 1 ounce of seeding. So 1 ounce gave me this density here, and that's terrific. And so that's what you really want to look for is a nice dense seeding so that they self-support. The next problem that we get a lot is I've used my seedling mix and I reused it, but I've got a lot of roots in it. How can I clean my soil to reuse it? Very simple solution again. Don't reuse your soil. That's a very common misconception that you can reuse your microgreen soil. And in theory, you can, but the amount of work and effort that goes into preparing fresh soil again, it's really not worth it. In my opinion, it's actually far more advantageous just to go with a really inexpensive potting mix or a really inexpensive growing medium of your choice that is nice and sterile and free of soil, and make sure that that it's nice and sifted. As long as it's all those things, I would not reuse, and I'd use fresh every single time. The reason because those roots become organic matter. All the plant roots that are in there, they stay in there. And what can happen is they can cause mold. And that mold is the last thing you want, which is another thing we'll talk about, which is another problem to troubleshoot. And it can only expedite the molding process because it is organic matter. A lot of your growing mediums, we use ProMix. So this is what I use. It's just a good bag of ProMix with mycorrhiza inoculated inside of it. That's what we use for our sprouts, but by no means do you have to use that. It's a nice soilless potting mix that is pre-sifted. It's got a great texture and it holds on to moisture really well, and it doesn't mold very easily. So don't reuse your potting mix. It's just best to throw it out in the garden or the compost pile. You don't have to throw it out, just don't use it for microgreens again. And the next issue that is seeming to come up quite a lot with microgreens is mold. Luke, I've got mold on my microgreens. I don't want to eat them because I'm worried I'll get food poisoning. Well, you're probably best to not eat those. Mold is not good to eat, and it's typically advised that if you do see mold on your microgreens to throw them out. And you can really kind of alleviate this problem altogether by actually one of 3 ways. The first way is by not reusing your potting mix. As I stated, those roots and that plant material in there will always be in there. It has to break down somehow. And when you add moisture to the equation, it only expedites the molding process, and that's just a recipe for mold on your microgreens. The second way you can alleviate mold on your microgreens is by giving them adequate airflow. See, down here, we have really good airflow because of the way our shelves are spaced. We have the furnace there with a cold air return. There's a very good cycle of air coming through here. But if you're in an enclosed room with not good airflow, put some fans down there. Your microgreens will appreciate it because they do need a lot more water than most plants do because of the density of how many plants are growing in that small square footage there. I mean, we've got probably close to, 5,000 plants maybe, ish, in that tiny little area. All of those need moisture to germinate, and so you got to give them a lot of water. But what can happen if you don't have good airflow is they can mold. And the third way you can reduce mold on your microgreens is by watering less. Now, it's important to understand that they do need water, and I will typically give my microgreens about a quarter gallon of water once a week. And that's what I found works really well for me. But again, that does not always work for everyone. That is based on my humidity, my airflow, my temperature. A lot of different variables goes into that. Even my soil type goes into that. So I always say just make sure that if you tip it, no water comes out. And if you press it, you can't see water bubbling up. You don't want it to be a saturated mess. You just want it to be like a damp sponge, something that's going to be damp to the touch, but not able to be squeezed and see water coming out. And that's pretty much your basic needed soil moisture for anything, not even just for microgreens, but even doing seedlings for your garden. They don't like to be saturated. And having soil that's oversaturated is a recipe for mold because the soil just can't breathe. And then it becomes anaerobic and things start breaking down in ways that they shouldn't. So make sure not to overwater. And the very final thing that I thought I would mention that seems to come up quite a lot, but again, it's very simple, is my microgreens got really bitter and really woody. What do I do? Well, that is because you let them go too long. You see, microgreens should be consumed no later than after they produce, focus there. Microgreens should be consumed when they start getting their first set of adult leaves. That is because when they start to grow, the stems start thickening and they become a little stringier and woodier. They also can subsequently become more bitter depending on what you're growing. And so if you want them to stay nice and fresh and crisp, just don't let them go so long. I typically say for things like brassicas or mustards, my turnaround time till harvest from the day I seed to the day I harvest is about 9 days. And again, that's just my personal preference, but it's right around 9, maybe no more than 10 days, and I'm cutting and harvesting and eating. If I wait any longer than that, they start to get past this phase where they start to produce their first set of true leaves, and they can get a little bit woody. And so it's a really simple solution. Just eat them, and you should be eating them. Microgreens are a fast turnaround crop, so whether you're selling them for market, selling them to restaurants, or consuming them yourself, nobody wants woody, stiff microgreens. And in the end, you're only going to damage your product by waiting on them longer. Consume them, restart them, consume them again, restart them, and just keep the cycle going, and you'll be far better off. So those are all of the issues that I saw in the comment section on all of our videos. But if you have any more, make sure to throw them down in the comment section below, and I'll be glad to answer them. And as always, this is Luke from the MIgardener channel, reminding you to grow big or go home. I'll catch you all later. See ya.